Hey, gorgeous! Welcome to the Business Mindset Podcast with Holly Wharton, which combines powerful strategies on how to upgrade your business mindset, along with practical business tips to grow your business. This podcast features solo shows with Holly and also interviews with inspiring women entrepreneurs from around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now, here's your host, Holly Wharton.
Hello and welcome to the Business Mindset Podcast, episode 209. This is your host, Holly Wharton, and I'm here with today's special guest, Carmen Spagnola. Carmen is a professional intuitive who helps conscious entrepreneurs make better decisions quicker. She shows spiritual seekers how to connect their soul to their work using intuitive readings, past life regression, and hypnotherapy. She's an international speaker and trainer and founder of the Numinous School of Intuition and the Numinous Podcast. Welcome, Carmen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to talk to you today. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and your business journey and how you got to where you are today with your business and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I suppose if I look at the last decade, that's really where the journey took me into the underworld descent, and I've emerged and returned in the last couple of years. I was working as a fairly public figure in the retail space in the west coast of Canada where I live. At the time I was living in West Vancouver, and I had very high-end, eco-friendly home furnishing store. So this was 2007. There was almost like an early peak conscious environmentalism kind of movement happening in the mainstream. Vanity Fair had green issues, An Inconvenient Truth was coming out. Domino magazine, which was like so hot then, which I still love now, was doing entire issues devoted to healthy living and green living, etc. So I was kind of riding that wave. And I don't know what you were doing in 2009, but I was getting sucked under a wave of a global recession in my business. And so one of the first things that seems to go onto the optional or voluntary list when people are in real financial crisis is our environmental values, because now we're in actual survival mode. So people just weren't spending $7,000 on organic mattresses, things like that. So it didn't take long for me to go, hey, wait a second, where did your values go? And my business was washed away. And I took it extremely personally. It definitely felt like a very public personal failure. You know, I'd been on national television. I was on hot design shows. I was on panels at conferences, consumer shows with very high up managers for companies like Lululemon and Mountain Equipment Co-op, which in Canada is kind of like our big outdoor retailer, outdoor gear outfitter. So I was always sort of the voice of like radical small business. And I felt like I'd failed. I felt like I'd failed entrepreneurs. I felt like I'd failed, quote unquote, conscious business people. It was extremely humiliating. And so I went through a bankruptcy. I went through a very long, dark night of the soul, deep depression. And I was a single mother at the time. So I was kind of living the double life of like, okay, I'm keeping it together for my daughter. I drop her off at kindergarten, and then I sit in my car and cry until I need to pick her up. It was really, really humiliating. And so I had a very strong spiritual practice up until that point. And then I felt quite abandoned by spirit. And then I got really mad about that because I was like, fuck you. I followed all of my intuitive guidance. Like I was so on path. All the signs said yes. What the fuck is this? And so I had to have that complete, like really literally a long dark night of the soul where it was kind of like the voice of God said, I've been here the whole time. Where have you been? You know, you have given up on yourself in such a horrifying way. And when you speak to yourself with that kind of bile in your tone and the self-blame and self-loathing, you are insulting spirit. Like you insult me with that. And I'm not here for that shit. And so if you want to be nice, we can work together. And so I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I have done that. I've been really shitting all over myself for quite a while here. Time to also accept that like I'm caught up in a moment as well. And now I just need to grow up and face the consequences of that. So I moved away from retailing because part of my epiphany there was like, oh, wait a second, we can't actually save the world by selling people more more shit, even if it's good shit, you know? And I'd been telling people that like very publicly for a couple of years. And so I felt really embarrassed about that. I moved away from sort of that thinking and that model and started to look much more critically, not just from an environmental perspective, but a cultural perspective at just kind of what is wrong with a culture of hyper-individualism and just the circumdrome of the internet. You know, this sort of idea that like, okay, well, I'm going to be self-employed, and so I have to have a presence on social media and out in the world, and I'm perpetuating a kind of veneer, and I don't want to do that because that doesn't feel honest. I actually feel like a piece of shit right now, but I'm like, I have this public-facing persona and a private persona. And I started to kind of realize like, oh my God, I'm like setting other people up to feel like a piece of shit because I look like I've got it together all the time, which I totally don't. So it was a few years of just unpacking how conditioned I was towards this idea of make it look good and hustle. And yeah, so I moved away from retail, and this whole time my intuition was actually getting stronger and stronger for other people. And I was working as a professional intuitive kind of quietly. You know, I had a lot of shame about that. Like there's a lot of social scorn that comes with being intuitive or kind of a woo-woo person. And so, and I have a certain aesthetic, Holly, that I like to maintain. So I was like, this is not fitting with my sort of Swedish design aesthetic to be all woo-woo. But then I actually was getting really good at it. What I understand now I went through a lot of training as a clinical hypnotherapist and took a lot of training around working with trauma and abandonment and all of that. And I kept extrapolating personal trauma to the collective and the cultural and realizing like, holy fuck, the internet has been super traumatizing. Capitalism is super traumatizing in our culture. Imperialism has been super traumatizing. And so I started to really shift away from the client that I would be working with as though they were the source or they were the center of their issue, and started to kind of go, have you ever thought about how patriarchy might be driving you fucking insane? Like, you know, have you ever thought about like, it might not be your fault that you are caught up in this kind of circumdrome of what we are calling culture, which is actually, I think, just re-traumatizing each other. And so, yeah, that's taken a few years for me to kind of try to dismantle a lot of the cultural and social conditioning, like out of my business, how I do business, like not trying to trigger people's trauma responses around lack or missing out or any of those things, you know, and changing how I market, changing the kind of work that I do, not always trying to grow every fucking thing, trying to keep my list really small instead of opening up, because I recognize my nervous system can't fucking take thousands of people on my subscriber list. So
can we pause for a second? Because I remember you said in a very recent podcast of yours about how you had totally pruned down in a very ruthless way your email list. And I was telling this story after I heard it on your podcast. I was telling the story to a friend of mine because we were talking about list size and that kind of thing. And she was like, I'm really struggling to grow my list. And I was like, well, I just heard the story the other day. And I repeated it to her and she was like, my God, I could never do that. I've worked so hard to build it up. So tell us about what you did, because I think this is really important because it's a totally different perspective on community list building. So tell us what you did.
Well, this is where I wish I was better at math, but I can use the examples here. So yeah, everything's always about growing your list and like engagement and yada, yada, yada. But if you look at any industry, average open rates, like an amazing open rate would be like 30%, right? Yeah. Am I right? Okay. Yeah. And so most people, it's lower. And as you grow your list, it gets lower and lower, right? So one of the things, as a person who is moving through the world, trying to work with spirit, one of the things I recognize is like, I'm actually really introverted and I don't like having so many people kind of in my energetic space. So I prefer to broadcast, and then like, I don't have comments on my website. I don't have anything. I put out a podcast, people can hear me, but I'm not trying to like draw them in unless there's somebody with whom I feel I have some soul work to do. you. And so what I started to recognize as I was growing my list and I got up to a couple thousand people, I actually found it super irritating. Like I didn't like my writing voice. I didn't like having all these people not opening. Like I was like, it just felt muddy and energetically congested. And so I really love a good purge. Like I want things to be like good feng shui everywhere. And I was like, my list is like bad feng shui right now. So I went through, and this was super arbitrary. I was like, okay, if people have been on my list for more than a year and they haven't opened 8 out of 10 of my emails. Now, also bear in mind, I send like 1 a month. It's not like I'm in their face. So that's like 8 out of 10 emails is not a big ask. And if they're not interested in that, I don't have soul work with this person. And so I could unclutter their inbox, and I feel like that would be a good service for them. So I will unsubscribe them. So I unsubscribed, and I kind of had this gray area with people who hadn't been on for quite a year yet. So I was like, okay, I'm going to keep 500 people on my list, but going forward, I'm going to keep looking at like who's been on for a year. And if you haven't opened 80% of the time, or if you're not somebody that I know is like a friend who actually wants to be on my list, like you might have missed it or whatever, but I know who you are. Maybe your rate's only 60%, some of my best friends, then I'll keep you on. And so what I did was I spent about a year, like almost every month going through, and it started to feel so good just to like delete people. I felt very empowered. I felt like I was reclaiming my space. It was just a bless and release, right? Like no judgment, just bless and release, like out you go. And then I started, after about a year, I actually put it right in my sign up, like, just so you know, this is how frequently I send. And after a year, if you're not opening very much, I'm going to unsubscribe you as a service to you. Like, thanks very much. And so people knew then, oh, if I get something from Carmen, I better open it because I want to stay on her list. So over time, took about a year and a half, I started to really recognize the names on my list. Obviously, a large portion of them were clients or people who'd come to my retreats and done spiritual work with me. But there's also people like, there's a guy who owns a resort down in Tulum, Mexico. Never been there, but I've like been on their website, and I sent him an email once, like asking, prices for retreats. And he's been opening for like super consistently for like 3 years. I'm like, wow, Roberto, like I've never met this person, but now I feel like I know him. And so this is what I do is I keep my list at 500 and 80% of the people open. So I don't know what the math would be on that, but I would imagine you'd have to have thousands of people to get 500 people opening every month and like really being engaged. So this keeps it clean. It keeps it joyful. I like seeing the people who open. I either feel like I know them or I do know them, and everybody else is not bothering me. Like they're not taking up the space. And so it's an energetic thing, but it's also an effectiveness thing. Like I would way rather be writing in a way that feels like I'm really speaking to people that I know. It makes my target market super clear. It's just, I feel like I'm in an intimate relationship with my list now, and 80% open rate feels awesome.
I love that. I love that. I think that's really terrifying for a lot of people, but it makes absolute sense the way you explain it.
Yeah, it definitely was what I would call like a threshold experience where I was like, okay, this is an experiment. It may not go right. And I feel really nervous about it, but actually it's worked phenomenally well. And the thing is, that's what the internet does, right? It tries to trick you. Yes. And all of the like marketing coaches and all that stuff, they have to keep you feeling like you're deficient in order for you to buy more shit. And so this is where I'm talking about, like we get conditioned by but we can all do math. Yeah. Look at this is actually a way lower risk proposition than trying to keep 10,000 people happy, And
it's less expensive because you'll be charged less on your software.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is what you call nature as therapist, or how nature can help you get the right mindset to run your business, or just be in the right space in business and life. And this is a topic that's really close to my heart because I love spending time outdoors. And when I first visited your website, the very first thing that I saw was the page on your wilderness quests. And my heart went, oh my God. So tell us a little bit about what nature as therapist means and how getting outdoors can help you in your business.
Sure. Yeah. I started to find after a few years doing clinical hypnotherapy, and I don't do behavioral hypnotherapy in the sense that it's like behavior change, like weight reduction or smoking. I don't do that. I do soul work, right? So it's pretty shamanic, etc. So, I would do workshops and retreats and things like that. And clients come and they leave feeling really restored, rejuvenated, yada, yada. But I started to feel feel as a practitioner that it was just a little too sanitized. Like, it's just a little too convenient that you can just like hop online, book a session with me, and whether we're doing it online or doing it in my office, it takes like 90 minutes and then you're like, I feel so much better, and they go out into the world. But actually, culture doesn't change. The context in which their healing is occurring doesn't change. And that's a huge part of being able to heal. And so I wanted to like open that up a bit. And I had been on a wilderness quest a decade ago, just before the collapse of my business. Thank goodness. I learned some skills, thank goodness. And that immersive experience gave me like a cellular memory of what it felt like to be a member of a collective or an ecosystem in relationship with something greater than myself, and as an eternal being, like outside of time. And it just felt so good. And like I said, I knew it in my bones that I was part of something bigger than just society. And so that had sort of stayed in the back of my mind for years. How could I do that? And so, of course, study, you take apprenticeships, you take all those things. And eventually I kind of was like, oh, look, I've become a wilderness guide who can lead pack horse trips, and I've apprenticed to lead vision quests. I kind of feel like this might be part of my path. And so I undertook a quest to see if it was my time to lead quests. And the answer came back resounding yes. So I started leading these immersive experiences, 12 days. And in the first few days, people are just remembering that they are part of a collective. Because as entrepreneurs especially, I don't know if I would imagine most of your listeners or many of them are entrepreneurs or doing it part-time. Yeah. So entrepreneurs experience some of culture's most alienating features on like an unrelenting day-to-day basis, like time stress, anxiety, unnatural loneliness, that hyper-individual concern. And again, that looping through the internet, having mediated experiences with the world. And so if you think about like, when in life have you felt closest to the deepest mysteries of life? Often people will say it's in nature, or sometimes it's in thresholds like my bankruptcy, or for some people it might be like childbirth or the death of somebody close. So nature and thresholds. And so there is this sort of animal instinct that we have, that is where spirit is found. So the immersive experience in the natural world helps us remember our primal self, but also reattune to what Malidoma Somé would call the indigenous archetype within each of us. And that's small I indigenous. I fully recognize we don't want to take from other people's cultures. And I'm also very suspicious of universality and that sort of thing. But the indigenous archetype in each of us is the part of us that remembers who we really are, where we belong, what our gifts are, and how to be part of a collective or part of an ecosystem without taking from others or taking more than our fair share. And all of us came from somewhere. All of us have ancestors to some land somewhere. And so when we remember that, if you think from a business perspective, if we want to keep this within the bookended of business, in business we need to know, like, what is our niche? What is our value proposition? How are we going to what's an authentic expression of that through our marketing? So knowing who we really are, where we belong, what our gifts are is fucking fundamental to being able to have a business that's resonant and in alignment, not just with your own soul, but then therefore will be with others. So yeah, nature as a mirror, nature as sort of a mythic companion is a way to get to the truth of all of those issues, who you are, where you belong, what your gifts are, and what your values are, and how you're going to express them in the world. So, and I also recognize though that like not everybody can go on a 12-day trip, right?
Yeah.
And also it's incredibly privileged to even imagine that nature is available to everyone. I have clients in Saudi Arabia. I can't be like, so you should just go outside and sit in the park. She'd be like, with my brother and my dad, like there's just cultural differences that we have to recognize. There's all kinds of impediments to nature. However, that natural animal self does have daily, monthly, seasonal rhythms. A person who's living in the middle of Manhattan in an apartment, or maybe not Manhattan, you have Central Park, but an urban city, or with not a lot of access because of disability or whatever, can still start to attune to seasons or the moon. When I think about, wow, how did I do my business when I wasn't in relationship with the lunar cycle? Because there are times to rest and times to grow and times to launch and times to go through ideation and creation and creativity. Just watching the moon and getting a relationship with her. I think everyone should go on a wilderness quest at some point. I think that it's one of the best investments I've ever made, like dollar for dollar, pound for pound. That was the best thing I ever did. However, whether it's that you make sure that you are getting touch every day from either a partner or an animal, or whether it's that you're growing flowers in your garden or food, getting into really intimate relationship food. I mean, that's the fundamental way that the human animal has learned about its interdependence with the ecosystem is through trying to sustain itself through, agriculture. So I think there are actually a lot of ways that entrepreneurs can soothe themselves and cope with a lot of the stresses of being a business person through these different forms of access to the natural world. Because it's been said many times, but nature is a tonic for the nervous system, and entrepreneurs really need that.
Yeah. So what would you say are your top tips for how entrepreneurs can get outdoors if they can't do a 12-day wilderness quest? You've mentioned some things, but what are maybe some of the slightly more intense ways that people can do it? So I know I just got back from like a 3-day walk in the middle of nowhere, but yet close to home. And that just completely just gets me in touch with myself and gets me in touch with nature and everything. But what are some other things that people could do?
Well, it's interesting because I definitely have clients who are like, oh yeah, I have to get into nature every day. Like when I ask them, what's your relationship with nature and the landscape? And oh yeah, I need it every day. And I'm like, that's interesting because like I have a dog and I walk her every day at the park and that sort of thing. But it's funny that I don't really categorize that as nature. And I wouldn't say I'm a person who's like, I need nature every day. Of course I do if I really think about it. Like I grow flowers and my husband grows tomatoes and things. However, some people, their rhythm is more like seasonal or once a year even. So they are more immersive. Like I'm like a camel. I go for 2 weeks and that experience can last me 2 years. Wow. So I also want to kind of recognize that not everybody's rhythm is quite the same. And I think part of that is like I do trance work several times a week, shamanic type journeying. So I have a very vivid sense memory when it comes to nature. So I think if you don't have that, if you aren't in that kind of mythic relationship where every animal is your ally or a messenger, then that's something you could start to cultivate in smaller ways. For some people, there's so much trauma that it's actually really difficult for them to articulate or remember or what it is like to feel and have sensory awareness. So for some clients, I actually have them do kind of like a sensory awareness inventory. So I would take them through a journey, like a hypnotherapeutic or shamanic type journey, and have them just remember a time when they felt really relaxed in nature. And then we start to do this inventory of like, allow your mind to wander and think about all of the sights that you love. So it might be your partner's face or your child playing outside. It could be art or something. It doesn't necessarily have to be nature, but you just think about all the things that feed you from a visual perspective. And then you go through sounds and then taste and touch and smell and then activities. And it is amazing how many of these pleasing, calming activities actually do occur in nature. And so once they come up with a few in each category, if you look at it afterwards, they have a grid now of anywhere from like 30 to 100 things that will help them self-soothe when they are in the throes of a launch or whatever. It's like they have a list there of like, these are the things that soothe my nervous system. So often it's nature, but sometimes we enter it in a slightly different way. Like I mentioned, through food or beauty or art or sound, music, etc. So sometimes that's a good place to start because I recognize how some people are like, I could never make it 12 days in the wilderness because in the middle of it, there's a 4-day fast and you're doing spiritual work. The other thing I would say is ritual and ceremony. So if you have ever gone out into nature or if that is something that's part of your regular routine, you might incorporate ritual into it because ritual, it accomplishes so many things. Number one, it keeps up our relationship and our end of the dialogue with spirit. It's kind of like, spirit, I've felt you moving through my life or through myself, received, got it. And so when we do a ritual, that's us affirming that relationship with something greater than ourselves. Also, it's a somatic experience. So it goes beyond words and into the body. And our body is our subconscious mind. So there's a ton ton of communication we can do about self-love, compassion, connection without needing to articulate it. Your body will know it as you, and it could be something as simple as leaving an offering for ravens, some shiny piece of thread in a tree, or your own hair for birds, or some kind of sacrifice, some kind of gift, or maybe you just touch a certain tree every time. So another nice thing to do is to find something that in your perception could be a mythic gateway, like two trees or two shrubs, and treat that as a threshold. I'm now going into sacred space with the natural world. Nobody needs to know, right? Like you can just be like, yeah, I passed these two rose bushes and now I'm in sacred space. And so everything that happens from here, I'm going to consider a message from spirit or some kind of oracle for me. And when I return, then I'm out of that. So we can use that as a way to access the subconscious, access spiritual connection, access intuitive downloads, etc. And so it doesn't really need to be like a major undertaking. But when you do that in nature, it's like you now have anchored your relationship to something greater than yourself. And then you'll never look at a rose bush the same. You'll never, every time you touch the tree, you'll have the compound interest of all the memory, the sense memory you have of all the wisdom and all the care and all the gratitude and all the love and all the grief and everything you've ever felt whenever you've touched that tree. It becomes an incredibly powerful unity experience. And that can really help us stay on path. So yeah, I personally, I'm a dive in 12 days person, but I also think that little altars everywhere is a really good idea.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing those tips, because I think that's given our listeners a lot of really different things that maybe they wouldn't have thought about. I spend tons of time out in nature, never thought about the mythic gateway. So I look forward to playing with that.
Nice.
So changing topic just a little bit, Carmen, do you have any women business mentors? Are there any women entrepreneurs who inspire you? And that could be in the outdoorsy kind of world in nature. It could be in the normal world.
Yeah. It's interesting. As a seeker myself, I've had a bit of a tough time finding teachers. The Wilderness Quest space is a highly privileged space. It means then that it's also a highly appropriative space, culturally appropriative. It tends to be, it really centers like a white male experience, like the hero's journey and all that kind of stuff. So I've become quite divergent in my teachers, and I actually have had trouble finding a way of presenting this work and sharing it that isn't appropriative. So I don't really have mentors in that area. I certainly have had very powerful teachers in the realm of spirit and developing my intuition. I spent quite a bit of time in France one year with my teacher, Judee Gee, her last name just Gee, and she wrote a wonderful book called Intuition, just very simple. You can get it on Amazon. And I mean, again, I read this just before my bankruptcy. And so thank goodness there was like a me ahead of me, willing me forward, taking me on all these very useful spiritual experiences that I was about to need. So that was great. But currently, when it comes to business, I'm really watching people who are dismantling oppressive practices in marketing, specifically Kelly Diels. Yeah, Diels. She talks about the female lifestyle empowerment brand, which is a perfect example of the circumdrome of the internet where things just keep you looping, right? Like needing to posture, that whole hyper growth, hyper luxury, extremely, compelling version of how to be on the internet that I just don't want to have anything to do with anymore. So she talks about like, how do we oppress other women by making them feel less than so that they work with us? Like, I don't want to do that. So, how can we stick with our marketing in a way that is good and effective, but takes out shame, takes out urgency, takes out social proof that basically says, well, they're doing it, so it must be good. It's like helping people to take their time and make really good decisions with their money and really good decisions as both consumers and marketers and entrepreneurs. So Kelly Diels, she has a newsletter that she calls a Sunday love letter, and I've been reading it. My husband and I'll read it, and then I'll be making all these weird, exasperating sounds. And this has been going on for like 18 months. And my husband would be like, what's going on? I was like, oh my God, she just talked about white supremacy in marketing, and it's so true. And so we've really just been unpacking how so many of our values that we hold so dear seem to get thrown under the bus as soon as you start to learn how to market. And it's been so many years now that I don't want to do any of that anymore. And Kelly is the first person who's articulated to me what's so icky about it, what's so dangerous about that. And really, it's not too many steps from from conventional, I guess what I would call like white male marketing to Donald Trump as president. Like it just isn't that many steps. And so each of us is a member of the culture, and we need to notice that our businesses are making culture. And is it supporting the kind of culture that I want? So that's the only person I would say I follow pretty religiously right now.
That is fantastic. And you know, the way I first heard about you was a couple of weeks ago. I've been talking to friends all over the place lately about how sick I am of marketing, like everything you just said. I hate it. I'm sick of it. Everyone sounds the same and it feels icky. And so I wrote this rant on Facebook and I was like, I can't think of people who are doing it differently. Who is doing it differently? Because I'm sick of everything the same and it's shitty. And a friend of mine who you also know, Kristen Marie Heron, said, oh, you should take a look at Carmen Spagnola. And I was like, oh, I've never heard of her. And so I went to her website and I was like, oh my God, love her. That's why we're talking today, because you are part of the group of online women entrepreneurs who are doing something different and not just doing the same crap of, I'm so fabulous and I have such a good lifestyle and don't you want to be like me? Just follow my blueprint.
Exactly. Look at my staged thing. And and I used to do, like, it was intuitive business planning, etc. I used to do business mentoring for other healing practitioners, etc. And then I just had to move away from it because finally I was like, I don't fucking know what will work for you. I just did a podcast and then I started culling my list, and those two things super worked for me. But I don't know what's going to work for you, but I know that you need to undertake the investigation as a piece of your soul work. And so I'd been doing it, just kind of muddling through as a way to stay in integrity with my soul. And then I read Kelly and I'm like, oh my God, she just named the thing I've been trying to do. Now I feel less alone. And so there are so many of us that are trying to reject sort of conventional marketing norms and sort of just that sense that you are the precious commodity, you know, that it's like, instead of you selling a commodity, you are the brand, you are the commodity, and there's only one of you. So you must be, what you have must be priceless. And now, what do you know? We are all marketing that way. It's just like, oh my God, we can't do this. We can't do this to each other. And also it's bullshit. So having somebody who can be our voice and give voice to what the things are that we are intuitively, inherently, naturally resisting and rejecting has been really a huge relief for me. So I highly encourage anybody who is resistant to marketing, and you probably have a lot of stories in your mind about why, but if you're feeling resistant, it's your soul, but it's also the fucking culture. And Kelly does an amazing job of applying critical cultural analysis to marketing, specifically women doing marketing and sort of marketing in like female empowerment spaces.
Excellent. So Carmen, how can our listeners learn more about you? How can they work with you? I know you've mentioned intuitive readings, past life regression, hypnotherapy, of course, the wilderness, not retreats, wilderness quest. So tell us a little bit about how people can work with you.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, as you can hear, Holly, I'm not a super easy to access person. It's really interesting because I used to say, oh, these are my offerings, like intuitive readings, regression work, or abandonment wound work, etc. But now I hold that space where I get a sense of what a person actually needs and not what they think they need. So people can't really work with me and sort of request, this is what I want. Sometimes with an intuitive reading, I will. But actually, if you go on my website, which is just carmenspagnola.com, you'll see that I have a new client application form. I have a pretty lengthy wait list usually. And so what I do is I go through occasionally and I'll look through and see, do I have a sense of resonance? This is an excellent thing too, in terms of like the next step after culling your list is having people have to fill out a form to work with you, because that totally filters tons of people. And so that feels great because I'm not a vending machine. I don't want people to be able to go on and just like press buy, right? So people would fill out a form. They don't have to put a lot in it, but they just say like, this is why I'm interested in working with you. And then I get back to them later, basically when I have time. So I want to make sure that I'm doing my soul work. And one of the things that has been fantastic, I used to always feel embarrassed about, but also kind of like almost as though I had weak moral fiber. As a practitioner, a healing practitioner, you're often told that, you know, as a therapist, you shouldn't have personal relationships. You need to be neutral with your clients. But I've just never been good at adopting that because I feel like I've known them for a long time, or I feel there's just an instant recognition if the work is meant to be done. And so I trust timing, and I trust that when they come into my life, it's because we have some work to do together. together. And so then it just does become a very soulful kinship that I really enjoy. And I can't get that with just everyone. So that's why I have people fill that out. The other thing I would say, though, is before they do that, it's a really good idea to listen to some podcasts, because that's kind of my cosmology. And it's important, I think, not that we see the world exactly the same way or we share the same politics or the same values, but that is me bearing my soul. So, you would just go on my website, find some topics that interest you. And I often think that the questions that I ask, if you have those same questions in your heart, then we're probably a good fit for working together, and then I'll walk the path with you for a while on your spiritual journey.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. So your website, your podcast, people can find on your website. Now, do you hang out online on social media or do you not?
I do, but I don't have like a business page or I don't go for likes, let's put it that way. So people can follow me. Like my Facebook is a public profile. So if you just look up Carmen Spagnola, you could just follow me there. But I would say Instagram is my kind of behind the scenes slice of life. And so that's the place where I sort of show, don't tell. Like, this is what it's like in my world. And so I generally don't post like big, long missives on Instagram, obviously, but I love Instagram. It's totally my jam. I really like it. So yeah. And I guess the other thing I should mention, so yes, Wilderness Quest, if you're thinking about it, your soul is speaking to you, we should probably talk about that. And my next one's coming up in August. And then I really just do one a year. So the next one won't be until July 2018. But the other thing that happens annually is the opening of the Numinous School of Intuition, which is an online year-long program. I created a textbook, so it only goes out to students. And then we have 2 classes a month. And one is an enrichment class where I sort of go off the page outside the textbook. It's like the stuff that it's too hard to write about, we have to talk about. And then I have a tutorial. And that's just like literally if you want an intuitive reading or a hit or, it's coaching, we talk about everything from people's personal things, like my husband isn't very spiritual or isn't on path. I feel like I'll kind of do some work, therapeutic work, or for people who are like, is it okay for me to smudge or is that culturally appropriative? We have major discussion. And so that is going to be opening. Registration opens in either July or August this year. And that you'll only really know about if you follow me or if you're on my newsletter or if you know somebody who's in the school. So, but I throw that out because I think that's a nice, I guess what I would say is, I've done a lot of intuitive training and spiritual work and like year-long coaching programs. And honestly, this is the one place where I'm going to claim it and say, this is like fucking amazing value. And like really takes you through all the seasons and all of the ups and downs. And yeah, it's been I think my best work happens in these monthly video calls and in the textbook, which is kind of a whole experiential textbook. It has all these little fun little goodies and envelopes. Anyway, it's kind of cool. So yeah, if people are interested in that, then I would invite them to sign up for my newsletter.
And keep on opening it.
Opening. Exactly. I don't send very many. So keep opening and let me know. That's like you saying, it's like me taking roll call and you saying here.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I love your perspective on things. I love talking about nature with you. You're fabulous. So thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me share. And thank you for kind of carving out a little bit of space for other natural beings in the natural world here on the internet. Sometimes it's good to, not that I give it voice, but just to bring it into the conversation. So thank you for making space for that. I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for listening. And remember to visit hollywharton.com/209 for the show notes on this episode. Thank you.
Hey, gorgeous. Welcome to the Business Mindset Podcast with Holly Wharton, which combines powerful strategies on how to upgrade your business mindset, along with practical business tips to grow your business. This podcast features solo shows with Holly and also interviews with inspiring women entrepreneurs from around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now, here's your host, Holly Wharton.